Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the dissertation defense of Tory Sampson. Before I start, I want to tell you all a few things about how this defense will proceed. First of all, Tory's going to give a summary of her dissertation work. Followed by that, each member of the committee will ask one question each to Tory. After the committee completes their questions, at that point we'll open it up to audience questions for roughly 5 minutes. Following the 5 minutes of questions, we're going to ask the audience to leave the room so that the committee can really dial down and ask Tory the hard questions. We'll keep that private. But don't go far, because following those questions, we'll have extra time with Tory. We'll ask the audience to come back inside and celebrate her success. All right. First, a few things about Tory. Tory got her bachelor's degree from Boston University in archaeology. In between undergrad and her PhD study work, she did a bunch of research work, working in a bunch of different labs. She worked closely with Ted Sapala in his lab, doing historical ASL data. She also worked in Israel with Wendy Sandler, and doing research in sign language with her as well. Also, while she was an undergrad student, she worked with Aaron Shield on sign language acquisition in autistic deaf children. And then she worked here at UCSD. While she was at UCSD, she was supported by an NSF predoctoral fellowship. And after a successful defense of her dissertation, she'll go back to Boston, where she's accepted a 2-year postdoc. And she'll be doing working with an NIH, National Institutes of Health grant there. Tory's committee members consist of Professor Ben Bergen from the Cognitive Science Department here, Dean Carol Padden, Dean of Social Sciences here at UCSD, Dr. Robert Plunder, who works here in the Department of Linguistics, and myself, Rachel Mayberry, and I also work here in the Linguistics Department. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. Tory's going to summarize her research here for us on the grammaticalization in American Sign Language, the case of nonverbal predication. And did you notice, how many people was it? There are maybe many? Yes. Yeah, you got it. Fantastic. All right.
I want to turn off the captioning, it's distracting. Let me just have those. Perfect. Hello. I want to start by saying thank you to Dr. Mayberry for that lovely introduction. I am pleased to be here presenting on my dissertation, the case of nonverbal predication in American Sign Language. This will include two approaches. This dissertation was largely exploratory and looking at nonverbal predication using historic sign language databases and experimental approaches. So first I want to start with an introduction. I'm going to be summarizing 3 studies, and then at the end I want to really point out the importance and the impact and contribution my dissertation makes. You see an example sentence on the slide. Sam reads. Sam is the subject, the topic, the spotlight of the sentence. And reads functions as the predicate. Often, predication is, in general, we see people researching verbs, but there are also other types of predication, noun and adjectival, such as Sam is Batman, or Sam is sneaky. Languages vary in how they create these statements, whether it's noun or adjectival predication, these things that cannot stand alone. Languages have different strategies to make these statements acceptable. And in English, we use the copular to be verb. And this copular verb functions as carries both tense, modality, and aspect, and provides copular support to the predicate. If we look at spoken languages, it seems to be a near linguistic universal that there are two types of strategies to predicate, both nouns and verbs, and they are distinct strategies. So let's look at some examples of verbal strategies. So verbs can be marked with agreement markers, such as person, number, or gender markers. They can also be marked with grammatical markers, such as tense, aspect, and modality markers. Word order is another strategy. It has a big role in predication. On the other hand, nominal strategies, we see word order, case marking, emphatic discourse markers, and copulas. And copulas are really the star of this dissertation, the spotlight. Copulas are auxiliary verbs and provide support to the nominal predication. So what do we know about predication strategies in sign languages? We know a lot about verbal strategies. In sign languages, you can mark for agreement, such as person and number. We also have aspectual markers. So we see cyclical movements, classifier predication, unique to sign languages, and also word order as a verbal strategy. Now, if we look at nominal strategies with sign languages, what we know is actually very little. It's nearly non-existent in research. And in this dissertation, I propose that there is copular predication as a strategy in sign language, specifically in American Sign Language with the use of the sign self with a null copula. And in the dissertation, I use an experimental method to test this hypothesis. First, let's review what we know for nonverbal predication in sign languages. Again, the research is very under-researched and very vague results. So sign languages frequently have been said to use non-manual markers, such as a head nod. Body movements, but specifically the head nod, is used to express nonverbal predication. Liddell in 1980 gives an example of this. You can see on the slide that John functions as the subject of the statement, and the noun phrase doctor functions as the predicate. And we see here there is a head nod applied directly on the predicate. However, in discussing with different native signers and just discussing what feels missing in this statement, there's something ill-formed, there's something in the context that this current dissertation deals with. Okay, we'll stop the video for now. And with the previous claim that I mentioned with the head nod, sign languages frequently have been said to contain no overt copulas, meaning no manual sign that has been used to give copular support. Instead, what is used is a null copula. So that has no overt form, but is there in an underlying structure. However, recent research has shown emerging copular signs. We see evidence of that in both Finnish and Icelandic sign languages. And as I will show, we also see this in American Sign Language. And this is really at odds with the statement that there is no overt copula in sign languages. And combine that with the fact that we have sentences such as John is a doctor, we see that to be diminishing in acceptability in present day ASL, so that triggered me to ask, is it possible that this emergence of the manual copular sign is also because of a diminishing role of non-manual markers, which I will discuss a little bit more in the next slide. And a well-known historical trait in sign language is what was originally conveyed with a non-manual marker, what was to convey lexical meaning, later transitions to a manual sign. So an example of that would be what we see on the slide, compare, an old French sign language, which is a predecessor of modern day ASL. This is the sign for compare. And you can see the movement is heavily placed on the head with a side-to-side movement. But if we look at today, present day ASL, the sign for compare, we see that the transition of the head movement to the primary movement on the hands. We can also see this with yes or no question structures, where you're using your eyebrow raise to convey the question, but now we see we can use the manual finger wiggle to convey the question without any non-manual markers. So again, this trend that we see of transitioning non-manual markers to manual signs triggered me to ask, emergence of manual nonverbal predication, is this a result of the diminishing role of non-manual markers? I want to discuss the first study where I researched the emergence of self in American Sign Language. This is the sign that we are discussing, self. This is the one-handed form. There's a second two-handed form as well. So before we dive in, I just want to point out that this gloss that you see on the slides are literally just a label for the sign, and it's not meant to correspond to the English concept for the word self. And previous research has already shown that these have very polysemous functions, and research has really emerged from my observations in certain sentences that I see that none of these functions can explain their use in present day ASL, which led to my dissertation. I want to first explain a grammatical pathway that is well attested in spoken languages, and that is the lexical copular cycle. So I will show you the stages of this lexical copular cycle, and I will then show the evidence that self has followed this grammatical pathway. Before the birth of a sign, you have the null form, where the sign does not exist. The sign that eventually becomes a copular function first emerges as dices, meaning that it must be rooted in physical context. So, for example, a point being rooted in the physical context. That sign later becomes demonstrative, which can be rooted both in physical context and also in linguistic context. For example, the English word this. It can be rooted as in this computer or as in this sentence I just uttered. And then the sign later in the cycle becomes a pronoun, which is used as a referential marker, and then later becomes, finally, the copula, which facilitates nonverbal predication. And that copula can become cliticized and then eventually semantically bleached and back to its null form. And that's where we see the cycle can continue. Any language can have more than one sign that travels through this grammatical pathway. And if you see the orange highlight around the stages, I'm going to highlight evidence that the sign self has traveled through those 4 stages. These are the three historical sources of sign language that I used. First, I'm not gonna get too in depth with the methodology. I can explain that more later in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But first, it was Old French Sign Language, and these were dictionary entries from the 1850s. Old ASL, video entries from the 1910s to the 1915s, and then present day ASL, which is the early 21st century. So I'll show examples. With Old French Sign Language, there are two dictionary entries from the 1850s. I did a manual search for relevant signs, and I found what I thought to be very interesting. These are old LSF pronouns. First and second person singular pronouns. And we see they're both deictic points, one to the signer and one to the perceiver. Pretty simple. So what we would expect a third person singular pronoun to be, but instead, we get a knuckle sign. We know the sign doesn't use the index finger, but instead it is a thumb, and it's an over-the-shoulder movement, which is not as clearly deictic. So how do we account for this discrepancy? So I propose that this sign, the third person singular pronoun, is actually a lexical blend of two signs. The first being the Old French Sign Language person classifier, which is the upright thumb, which is to represent a human being in spatial relationship to other people. So we can see that and vestiges of that in ASL signs, like superior, assistant, chase, all using the same upright thumb. And the second sign being the deictic point. Many emerging sign languages use the deictic point in conjunction with the person classifier to refer to a location that is associated to the referent. So an old LSF signer, you could imagine they would initially produce those two as distinct signs, and then over time with phonetic reduction, and the sign blends and becomes this third person singular pronoun that we see in old LSF dictionary entries. So it comprises, thank you, it is comprised, of both the demonstrative and the deictic stages in this. And next I looked at old ASL. There were a total of 14 videos that were commissioned by the National Association of the Deaf. They were stored in a historical ASL database, which was already gloss and coded. So all I had to do was manually search for the sign self. And what I discovered in that database, there was only one form for self that appeared in old ASL. And in total, there were 86 instances of the sign self in the 14 videos. And you can see that it strongly functions as pronominal when you compare it to emphatic, reflexive, or copular functions. I'll give an example in the next slide of that. And you can see self refers to Abraham Lincoln, which was mentioned previously in the discourse. The next sign, wonder, is a verb. So we coded that as self as a pronoun. So we'll just watch it once. Okay. The third, I collected a corpus of present day ASL using publicly available videos, YouTube, Facebook, any instances of the sign self. And I collected 100 instances of the sign self. And what I found is that both forms of the sign self appeared. So the emergence of self 1 we see in present day ASL. And what's interesting is that this can also be used to provide with non-human subjects. So out of 100 instances of the sign self, we can see this dramatic shift from a pronominal function in the old ASL database to a copular function in present-day ASL use. And I'll show some examples of some videos on the following slide. First, I want to point out that the copular function was 72% of the instances. So we see strongly that it appeared with nouns 57 times and 15 times with adjectives. And we see here, Kieran is topicalized as a subject, so you'll see the raised eyebrow. And then that's the indexical point, which is functioning as a pronoun, so referring to Kieran. Self one is the copula because deaf right is a nominal predicate. So let's watch. So the findings from study one well, there has been studies of sign languages. There has never been an internal reconstruction that had been used internal reconstruction methods. This was the first using empirical evidence to study a grammaticalization process in sign language. And it really tracked the emerging use of self in ASL and in its use of nonverbal predication, which was never done before in American Sign Language. Now I'd like to move to the second study, which focused on nominal predication in ASL. And this obviously makes up a large part of the category of nonverbal predication. And here we're interested in what our potential copula use, or what our potential copular supports for nouns in ASL. Self, the indexical point, and null are each strategies that I will explain. In my previous corpus study, I showed that self functioned as a copula with strongly with nominal predication. The indexical point functions primarily as a pronoun in present-day ASL. And as you may recall, self used to function as a pronoun in old ASL, and we see that it has become more of a copular function, which triggered me to ask, could the indexical point function as a copula as well in present-day ASL? Is it following the same copular cycle? And with null, as I mentioned, it's not overt, it has no manual sign, but it is said to be there as in the underlying structure. And previous research has described that the null conveys nonverbal predication in ASL, both with or without the head nod. So we're testing whether these can provide copular support. I made 3 predictions based on the 3 potential copulas. Because self functions as a copula, I predict that self would be rated higher with nouns than with verbs. My second prediction is that because the indexical point functions as a pronoun, I suspect it would be rated higher with verbs than with noun. And my third prediction, with the null already being described to function as a copula, and because it has no overt form, my prediction was that it would be rated equally between nouns and verbs. So the participants in study 2, there were a total of 30 deaf participants. They were all ASL users, and they used ASL as their primary language, and they learned ASL before the age of 2. The age range was 22 to 71 years old, with the median age being 28. The participants took an online Qualtrics survey. They were at home during COVID, Their task was to view a video of a signed sentence, and then there was a Likert scale from 1 to 7 that they could use to rank, and I will show you examples of that on the next slide. And they also had initial practice to observe and get comfortable with the interface. There were a total of 272 sentences signed by a native signer. Total of 72 target sentences, and the rest were fillers. It was a 3x2 factorial design, 3 copula types, 2 predicate types. And I'll show you an example of that. So these are example stimuli, and let me show you a video of what it looked like. This is what the participants saw, of course without the sentence that is glossed below. So the participant is asked whether that sentence is acceptable in ASL or not. 1 would be completely not acceptable in ASL, and 7 being like as acceptable as possible. And you can see there's also NA at the end. That was for if the video didn't load or there was some reason the video didn't work, the participant could skip. And the results, before we did the statistical analysis, the data points were Z-transformed to control for the scale bias. So if, for example, a participant favored the 4 to 7 part of the Likert scale heavily, or other participants really used the 1 to 7 more fully, that's why we transformed that data to be able to compare, to normalize and compare it across participants. We used the Bayesian model, t-test, and the R and Bayes factor package. The Bayesian model provides the ratio of likelihood that a model with one extra parameter is more likely to occur than the other null hypothesis model. So it's a likelihood scale. Okay, now the data. So we can see on the left, nouns, you see the predicate type, noun. We can see with the white, self, that represents. You see it's significantly different than the point or null for nouns. And when comparing sentences with self, sentences with noun predicates are statistically stronger than sentences with verb predicates. On the other end of the spectrum, the null is rated statistically different. It shows strength in verb predication as opposed to noun predication. And in the middle, the indexical point shows no statistical difference between nouns and verbs, although it does show a slight preference for verb predicates. And this really shows the interaction that we see here, that self is really strongly preferred with nouns, and that the null is strongly preferred with verb, and the point is in the middle and isn't preferred either way. And there was no evidence for predicate or copula effects. So interpreting what these results mean, we know that self is more acceptable with nominal predicates, it's rated higher, which suggests that the previous corpus study findings are confirmed, and really the validation with the experimental approach and the natural data approach. Out of the 3 potential copular types, self seems to be the predominant strategy to predicate noun phrases. Or on the other hand, null is more acceptable with verbal predicates, which suggests that its use as a copula or providing copular support in noun phrases is questionable. Which we referenced in Liddell 1980, so it's in contrast to those findings. The point showed no difference between nominal and verbal predication, which is interesting, and which was an interesting result. So is there a potential use of the point as a strategy in nonverbal predication? Maybe the point does have that ability to provide copular support to noun phrases. We investigate that a little bit more in study number 3. So in study 3, we focus on the other component of nonverbal predication, which is adjectival predication. Adjectives are generally considered to be a semantic, syntactic intermediary between nouns and verbs. Adjectives show properties, qualities, as opposed to nouns, which refer to objects, and verbs, which refer to events or actions. And because of that intermediary stage or status, adjectives are treated as this semantic, syntactic intermediary. Stassen in 1997 showed that adjectives in this category can be predicated using either 100% of verbal strategy, 100% of nominal strategy, or a combination of both. And languages that use both types of strategies are what are called split adjective languages. And this split is what Stassen calls the permanency parameter. And this parameter for stative adjectives, so stative adjectives show a more permanent property and are more likely to be used with a nominal strategy because it's a property that's very similar to nouns because it's so stative. On the other hand, dynamic adjectives that show less permanency properties, they are more transient and temporal, they're more likely to be used with verbal strategies. I want to review quickly what we know about adjectives in ASL. Luce in 2014 and 2022 showed that there are categories of adjectives that prefer to be either modifiers, as in deaf, as in a deaf student. And the second group are predicates, such as healthy, as in man healthy. And I don't know if you're catching on, but you see that deaf is the more permanent or more stative property, whereas healthy is the more dynamic and temporal property. And because we're looking at nonverbal predication, which we don't really know much about adjectival predication in ASL, that prompted me to ask, is the use of self, this copular self, governed by this adjectival distinction? And how does this distinction appear in ASL and nonverbal predication in general? So here I'm focusing on the two potential copular types of self and the indexical point. Those are the two that have the overt form. Null is really hard to account for. And again, because stative adjectives show more of a permanency property and function as a copula more often for nouns, I suspect that self will be rated high with stative adjectives. And my second prediction because dynamic adjectives show properties that are more transient, like verbs, and because the point is considered to be pronominal, I suspect that the point would be rated higher with dynamic adjectives. Participants engaged in a task very similar to study 2. This time around, there were less videos, so 192 sentences by a native signer. The sentence had 3 components: a fingerspelled name, a copula, either self or the point, and then an adjectival predicate, a dynamic and a stative. So this was a 2x2 factorial design. There was a total of 32 experimental sentences, 8 in each condition. These are examples of adjectives I used in the experiment. You can see the distinction. So as a diagnostic, I used a spectral modulation, so cyclical movements on these signs. So the dynamic adjectives you can apply aspect directly on. You can do cyclical movements on these adjectives. Why the stative adjectives, smart, deaf, wise, you cannot. So here's an example of the video stimuli. Simple, 3 signs. And the results. Again, the data was Z-transformed and also again used Bayesian modeling, R and Bayes factor package. I know it doesn't look like much, but statistically, we see that stative adjectives, there is no difference between the point and self. But for the dynamic type of adjectives, we see that self is strongly dispreferred. And if we look at sentences with the sign self, sentences with stative adjectives are rated statistically higher than with dynamic adjectives. And then sentences with the indexical point showed no difference. So we see substantial evidence for the interaction effect and decisive evidence for the predicate effect. And we see that the stative shows no difference, but the dynamic shows a difference. So interpretation of those results. Only my first prediction was supported, that self was preferred with stative adjectives. This suggests that the use of the copular self is modulated by semantic as well as syntactic properties of the predicate. However, the dynamic adjectives potentially don't have a certain type of property that really encourages the use of the copular self, which is an interesting discovery. Because stative adjectives show properties more similar to nouns and can use the copular self, that shows that there is a cohesive nominal strategy in ASL. On the other hand, with the indexical point showing no difference, showing no preference between either type of adjective, there are 2 potential interpretations here. One being that because the point was rated with no difference in study number 2, which I previously went over, with nouns and verbs, and again here, could the indexical point be an emerging copula? Maybe not emerging, maybe it is a copula. Or is it that ASL adjectives are more stative adjectives? And so they're predicative themselves. They don't need overt copulas to provide support. They function almost verb-like and can stand alone. So focusing on the stative adjectives, if you can use the point with stative adjectives, what is the role of the use of self? Why do we see the use of self when you can just use the point? So I propose that the use of self also, as a nominal strategy, is also as an overt copula being used in the sentence, also induces a truth conditional interpretation of the sentence. In that the truth value becoming it's either true or false. This is also called grammatical modality. So again, showing the intention or the beliefs of the signer, conveying that this is true as opposed to personal experience with words like maybe, must, should. So in contrast to the lighter indexical point, maybe the signer just expressing their belief or their experience, but instead saying this overt copular function really shows an assertion of truth or fact. And an example. So in this sentence, we've established Cain is deaf. And it's rated equally with Cain point, Cain self. But if you add some sort of statement where the signer is not sure, then the perceiver will say that this is not a well-organized sentence. As opposed to so using the sign self and then adding the I think makes the perceiver feel it's ungrammatical. So we see this use of self more in news reports where the person producing the sign is not asserting it on behalf of themselves, but asserting it as truth or fact. And the use of self is behaving very similar to other copulars that we see in Finnish and Icelandic sign language. And these copulas are not being able or not used with other modal signs, and that again triggered me to propose maybe sign language copulas are unique in that they only carry modality, not tense or aspect. So that's more the area of spoken language copulas and the functions of spoken language copulas. This is still a working hypothesis, of course. So in conclusion, I would like to point out the significance of my dissertation. It shows a novel finding of an overt copula in ASL, which is really an unprecedented finding and adds largely to our understanding of nonverbal predication in ASL and what it is in ASL. And the knowledge previously was very non-existent. I also used novel methodological approaches in that I cross-validated with natural data using corpus study and experimental approaches. And I was able to successfully replicate a certain function in the experimental setting. I also presented a coding standard to analyze sign language data, and that can be used in other studies. This dissertation really is a step into the impact of semantics and syntactic properties on nonverbal predication. So we're now beginning to be able to distinguish between verbal and nominal strategies in ASL. And this will have cascading implications on our understanding of predication in sign languages in general. So I want to take a moment to thank certain people. So this is the Mayberry Lab, both present and previous iterations of the Mayberry Lab that I've been a part of. I also want to thank my financial supporters, NSF and NIH. I also want to thank my dissertation committee members who are here. And also, of course, I want to thank everybody here at UCSD Linguistics and Cognitive Science Department for making my educational journey possible. I'm very grateful for everyone who was a part of it. Thank you. Thank you. So now we need every member of the committee to ask their one question. And then once we're done with that, the audience can ask questions for 5 minutes, okay? Okay, who wants to go first? Very, very nice job, Tori. So I had this question while I was reading, and it was actually something you covered in one of your last slides. You're mentioning that sign language, the function of the copula is throughout sign language, except it doesn't add tense or aspect. So that might be unique that copulas in sign language don't carry that function. It's the same that I say verb agreement, you know, we have this verb agreement person number, but oh wait, sign language is unique because only a certain group of verbs have agreements, whereas other plain verbs, for example, do not. Aspectual verbs do not. But verbs, transient verbs have agreements. So, or we look at classifiers, and they're not exactly like classifiers from spoken language. They're not exactly, they're not obligatory with nouns. So with all of that, I want to get back to your last statement. What is wrong with tense and aspect? Why isn't it there? Why doesn't self carry that? It's copular in every sense except that way. Do you have any understanding of why it's unique in that way? You know, with classifiers and verb agreement, we haven't decided why they're unique, so I'm wondering your thoughts on that uniqueness. Thank you for that question. I think, you know, the discussion about the property of copulas and why I don't think it doesn't have the tense or aspect like we see in spoken language, but it does have modality. So I have several hypotheses as far as that. First of all, tense is often expressed using other signs, like last week, will. So there are signs that are very specialized to convey tense and not always necessarily on a verb. So that's what I think about tense. Now for aspect, again, looking at verbs and how you can express that with cyclical movements. But then, out of all these possibilities with tense and aspect, that you can use a copula, but you think, why not? Why not have a cyclical movement with self, right? Why wouldn't we see that? So I think that's where we see the semantic properties of the predicates come into play. So nouns, you don't usually express aspect with nouns. So for example, the English sentence, she has been a teacher, you would say since she's a teacher. So I think that self really shows this basic relationships between the subject and the noun phrase, and adjective phrase. Now, another hypothesis I have on that is that I think we have to continue to consider ASL as a type of Creole language. That Creole languages tend to mark morphologically very segmented. That it's not, we don't see a lot of things at the same time. And so maybe ASL isn't at the stage where it's starting to really be able to layer those type of grammatical information. In this copula, we're seeing this emergence of a copula in the last 100 years. So we're talking about a young language, and maybe it hasn't gotten to the stage yet to be able to carry that in depth of the grammatical information. But that's something I ask myself too. Yeah, thank you for that question.
So thank you, Troy, that was really clear. I guess my question is probably born of ignorance, so this may be a simple-minded question. At first, I realized that I had mistaken notions of the function of non-manual markers and the manual markers, because I was thinking, oh, the non-manual markers, they kind of do more pragmatic stuff, and the manual markers do more morphosyntactic stuff. But that's clearly not true, because you can find counterexamples when I thought about it. But then I started thinking about what is it actually that motivates in the grammaticalization process? Motivates things to move into the manual channel the way they do. I mean, obviously that's the primary mode of communication. But I just started wondering about it. And one of the reasons I thought about it was related to a dissertation that I actually was the advisor for, believe it or not, on sign language. And that has to do with eye-gaze verbal agreement. And, you know, what we found there was that the manual agreement is obligatory, obviously, as Carol pointed out in her dissertation. But the I-Days agreement is there across both native signers and, well, all native signers, so deaf native signers and the hearing of deaf native signers. The I-Days agreement is there, but it's almost always there, it's like around 70% of the time. And so, since you talk about things moving from non-manual markers into manual markers, I was just wondering how to conceptualize that particular phenomenon, because it seems like the I-Days agreement isn't going away. It's still very much there. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it's kind of like there's kind of like this thing, right? Yeah. So, so just in general, I was curious about how you sort of look at in a larger framework this movement or proposed movement of non-manual markers to manual markers. What motivated it? What motivates it? And what are the mechanisms?
Okay, so I feel like the gist of the question is what's motivating the specification of those communicative intentions or communicative meanings. So why is this transition to manual? Why don't just leave it on the face? Why is this the trend? So I think there's some potential possibilities, and I think they're all connected to the larger discourse. So for example, the education of the deaf community. It was the big socio-linguistic setting, the context. So previously, we didn't see education being accessible, right? So, for example, Tory, me as a person, when I talk to a person as Tory, and I'm just chatting with somebody, I can do that, right? But maybe over time in an educational setting, you have to say things that you didn't experience for yourself. Tory didn't experience that. I don't know that. It's more like I'm learning things and things are being conveyed and what information I know. So this is a different type of, it requires a different type of interface in your communication and your discourse. So I have, for example, the notion of self as modality, as being this assertion of truth. I think that again really comes from this educational approach that, like for example, Malta itself is an island in the Mediterranean Sea. I can say that, but do I know for sure that Malta is in the Mediterranean Sea? No, but I'm as the signer neutralizing that sentence. I'm taking Tory out of this statement, and I'm using the language only to convey this abstract idea or thought or fact. And nothing of that is my own, if that makes sense. So this need to transition it away from the signer. And the second thing, so that I think is more of the motivation. So I think that's a big motivation is to have the language become more neutralized for the signer. And then I think also, it's difficult to measure non-manual markers and how much. I think it's vague, the boundaries. So for example, with your eyebrows, how much does it go? Like how much do you have to have movement to be grammatical meaning? And so of course there's also diversity in communication, and then that we see that there's different types and different ways to convey different types of messages. So I think so, for example, the eyebrow big raise for yes or no questions, and we see that transitioning to the finger wiggle. Maybe, and the motivation for that could also be like maybe we're on the phone a lot, and so we want to make our questions clearer. I mean, there's a variety of reasons. I don't know if I have the tools to answer that directly, but I do think that trend that is motivated. But I think that I'm interested in finding the mechanisms behind it.
Well, first of all, Tory, it's been really exciting to see you develop this line of research. It's gotten so rich and deep, and it's really exciting. I think one thing that really continues to interest me here is when you have multiple options as a signer to communicate very similar information. One channel is just to say nothing, another is to use a non-manual sign, and then you have multiple possible signs. I I guess I wonder, under what are the pressures that lead an individual in a given instance of language production to select one or the other? One thing could be efficiency. Obviously, it's more efficient to the signer to produce nothing, to use a null copula. That may not be more efficient in the long term because these may not be understood as well. But it did occur to me that in your adjective case, the dynamic sign, the dynamic adjectives are longer than the stated ones, right? Because they have this reduplicate, they have this motion intrinsic in them. And it could be that people are less happy with longer articulations in cases where the other stuff around them is longer. So one reason might be efficiency. Another reason might be sociolinguistic features or pragmatic features, or you were noting like an epistemic causes. So I guess I wonder what you're thinking about what leads an individual producing language to choose one of these or the other.
So the question really, talking about the diversity, the dimensionality of sign language. So which strategy the signer chooses. And I think that is something that is also sensitive to the discourse context. And that, again, hasn't been studied enough in sign languages. How do I want to say it? I think so much of it varies. Okay, let me go back to with the longer articulation. I think I'm thinking about that. So in this study, I controlled for reduplication, which means that it was a single movement that was reduplicated, but it was always twice. So technically, in both stative and dynamic adjectives, they had reduplication stimuli. So I don't think that the length would be as much of a factor. But I think people do use length to express more emphatic. I think there's a lot of underlying cognitive, communicative mechanisms that we still don't really clearly understand when it comes to nonverbal predication. I think a lot of people see me as a very expressive signer, but this is my communicative intent, right? This is my message I'm conveying, whereas other people who have more of a flat affect, or they tend to be that way, they don't use non-manual markers. We see them more likely, those type of signers, to rely on more manual means. And maybe that's not traditionally thought of as ASL, and then now we're getting into kind of language context stuff there. But I think that I don't have a good answer to this really, but like why do we use strategies? Why does signers use these strategies? Thank you. Okay, now we have time for people in the audience to ask questions if we have any. But you do have to come up, please. Everyone has to come up to the front of the room. Talk or sign. Either way. Any questions? Mm-hmm.
Well, I have many questions. It's a beautiful piece of work, and I hope it's the beginning of a process because there's so much to explore, and especially in the manual level. It was really enlightening. It's one of those cases where you get so excited that you want to know more, you want to study more. So I'll mention just a couple of among the shortest questions. One is, since self seems to be derived from a sign that was used to identify kind of a classifier to identify human beings, do we now find self in predication where the subject is no human? So no Ruth, no Tory, but the table is small. Can you find that is it productive and signers judge it okay? And the second question suggestion is like you mentioned language contact, and I was wondering, Finnish and Icelandic, these are the spoken Finnish, the spoken Icelandic, these are languages that have over culture. And now you're saying that the signers of Finnish sign language, Icelandic sign language, they are moving towards creating an overt copyright. What about in Russian? Spoken Russian does not have an overt copyright in the present. What's happening in in signed Russian language? Do we see something similar? And is there a correlation? Thank you.
Those are really great questions. So let me start, I'll actually start with your second question with Finnish and Icelandic Sign Language. I'm trying to remember historically, Finnish Sign Language, they are actually, their copula is from an affirmative marker. So it was what they call pi. So it's an affirmative marker that we see like this. And it used to correlate to a head nod. So again, we see this head nod that's rooted in this nonverbal, non-manual markers and nonverbal predication. We see that that head nod now has become this pi, this affirmative sign. Would I call that, did I think that has language contact with spoken Finnish and their copulas? I don't think I have data to answer that specifically. But now with Icelandic Sign Language, their copula is bid, and it's a point like this. Very similar to self in ASL, where it comes actually from the Netherlands Sign Language, a third person pronoun. So I think again that goes to show that the emergence of a copula in sign language, really we see it as a linguistic cycle, a grammatical pathway, not necessarily from language content. And I think, and then the other part of your question, with the English having a copula and ASL having a copula, but the copulas behave so differently. So I think that in English, for example, it requires an adjective, or in ASL it does not. So I think when we see that the behavior is so different, that it shows that it doesn't have to be language contact that motivates the emergence of a copula. And then your first question, oh my goodness, I forgot your first question.
It was about self. If it's limited to human subjects, the copula self, or it's better?
Right, thank you for repeating that. Let me, and I was gonna pull the slide, but you know what, I'll just sign it instead. So if you, in present day ASL, in the corpus study, I found two forms that were the one-handed self, and the second being the two-handed form of self in the present day ASL. And so this was only observed, the two-handed self only appeared with non-human subjects, where the one-handed self only appeared with human subjects. So I saw all over and over again, like alcohol itself isn't good. That event is free, but then the event using self, the two-handed self. But if a signer would never express that event's one-handed self is free. The two-handed form of self we do see with human subjects. We also see it used with, it's some type of semantic bleaching that we're seeing there, that it's losing its phi features and it's not able to refer to people any longer. So it's starting to become that, yes. I hope that answers your question. Okay, great, thank you. We have one more, I think.
Thank you so much for this really excellent talk and what I'm sure is a wonderful dissertation. I'm looking forward to reading it. I guess, sort of my question is building on Ivano's, which is about the difference between